The morning Cora Finch turned away the magistrate's man. For the third time in a fortnight, she had flour on her hands, ink on her apron, and not a single coin left in the tin above the hearth. She did not cry. She hadn't cried since the day they buried her father. And even then it had been brief. 2 tears, quickly pressed away with the back of her wrist before her younger brother Ned could see. There was no use in crying when there were broadsheets to typeset, a press that needed oiling, and a boy of 14 who looked to her for everything. The print shop had been Aldous Finch's pride for 22 years. He had built it himself, piece by piece, from a second-hand Stanhope press he'd hauled up from Halifax on a borrowed cart. The shop sat on the corner of Millbrook's main road, its sign hand-lettered in her father's careful script. Finch & Co., Printers, Est, 1851. She had never changed the sign. She wasn't sure she ever would. But the press needed a new feed roller. The old one had cracked in January, and she'd patched it with oiled leather and stubbornness, and it had held, just barely, through the winter. Now it was April, and the leather was giving out again, and the proper roller would cost £4 she didn't have. The magistrate's man, a small person named Durrell with a habit of sniffing before he spoke, had informed her pleasantly that if the back rent wasn't settled by the 1st of May, the building would revert to the estate. "The estate," Cora said flatly. "The Ashby estate." Durrell sniffed. "All properties on this stretch of Mill Road belong to the late Lord Ashby's holdings, Miss Finch. I'm sure you knew that." She had known it in the way one knows that winter comes, abstractly, at a distance. Her father had paid his rent to Ashby's land agent every quarter without incident for 2 decades. But Lord Ashby had died the previous autumn, and since then the land agent had changed twice. The rent had gone up without notice, and now someone called Durrell was standing on her threshold sniffing at her. "I'll have it sorted," she said. She didn't know how, but she said it with enough certainty that Durrell took his hat and went. Ned appeared from behind the type cases the moment the door closed. He was at the age where he tried to appear unconcerned by things and succeeded only in looking as though he was trying very hard to appear unconcerned. "Is he coming back? Not until May." Cora turned back to the press. "Hand me that cloth, Cora." "The cloth, Ned." He handed it to her without further argument. That was the thing about Ned. He pushed to the edge of a conversation and then stepped back. Their father had been the same way. She had always been the one who stepped forward. She was 27 years old. She had been running this shop alone for 14 months. And she was beginning to understand that running it alone was not, in fact, the same as being able to keep it. The stranger appeared on a Wednesday, which was press day, which was the worst possible day. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the wooden step, a pause, then a knock that was somehow both tentative and solid, the knock of someone who wasn't sure he was welcome but had decided to knock anyway. "We're not open for orders today," she called without looking up from the composing stick. "I'm not here for an order." The voice was quiet. Educated, she noted. Not the flat vowels of the county. Not the clipped efficiency of a Halifax merchant. Something older in it, more careful. She looked up. He was standing just inside the door he'd opened himself, which told her immediately that he was either comfortable with entering places unbidden or had been raised somewhere that doors were not left closed. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his middle 30s, wearing clothes that had seen considerably better days, a good coat gone threadbare at the elbows, boots that were well made but caked with road mud. His face was lean, a little gaunt, as though he'd been eating irregularly. His eyes were grey and direct, and taking in the shop with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were looking at. "Then what are you here for?" she asked. "Work," he said. "Any kind. I have some experience with mechanical things." Cora set down the composing stick. "What kind of mechanical things?" He looked at the press. "May I?" She studied him for a moment, then gestured. He crossed the room. She noticed he moved carefully, not touching anything he hadn't been invited to touch, and crouched beside the press with the easy balance of someone who spent time on his feet. He examined the feed roller without being told where to look. That alone was interesting. "This is a Stanhope," he said. "My father's. The roller's cracked." He touched the leather patch lightly with 2 fingers. "This is good work, but it won't hold much longer." He stood. "I can machine a proper replacement if you have the materials, or I can source one if you know where to look in this town." "There's a machinist on Birch Street," Cora said slowly. "But the materials cost more than I." She stopped herself. She didn't know this man. "What's your name?" "Rowe," he said. "Just Rowe." It was an unusual answer, not John Rowe or Mr. Rowe, just Rowe, offered flatly, as if the rest of it wasn't available. She filed that away. "Miss Finch," she said. "This is my shop." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. "Your father's name on the sign. My father is dead. The shop is mine." She said it without softness because she had found that the soft version invited pity, and pity was not useful to her. "I can't pay much. Room and board and a small wage, and the room is a storage room that has a cot in it, which I want you to know up front is not comfortable." He looked at her steadily. "That's fine. I haven't said yes yet." "No," he agreed. "You haven't." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances or smiles, or the slightly desperate quality of a man who needed the job too badly. He just waited. That steadiness was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and she had always been better at reading type than reading people. But her instincts said good. 3 days, she said. Trial arrangement. You fix the roller, you help on press day, you don't touch the accounts or the type cases without asking. If it works, we talk about what comes after. 3 days, Rowe agreed. He started that afternoon. He was good with his hands. She established this within the hour. He didn't have the machinist's precise training, but he understood how things fit together in the way that some people simply did, an intuitive sense of tolerances and pressures that couldn't really be taught. He took apart the feed roller assembly with a concentration that she recognized because she had it herself when she was setting type, that state of being entirely elsewhere and entirely present at the same time. Ned watched him from around the corner of the type cases for most of the afternoon, before finally giving up the pretense of indifference and simply standing there watching openly. Rowe noticed and did not comment, which rose considerably in Cora's estimation. By the end of the first day, he had assessed what could be salvaged and made a list, in a handwriting she noticed was exceptionally neat, of what needed sourcing from the machinist. He left the list on the composing table for her without commentary. She read it that evening after Ned was in bed. He'd broken down the costs, listed alternatives for each item in order of price, and noted which combinations would be fastest versus most durable. It was a thorough piece of analysis. It was also the kind of analysis that required understanding both the mechanical problem and the financial constraint, the second of which she hadn't told him about in any detail. She sat with that for a while. He hadn't asked about the rent. He hadn't asked why the tin above the hearth was empty, which she was fairly certain he'd seen when he helped her move a box on his way to the storage room. He'd just quietly mapped out the cheapest path to a working press. She approved of that. The second day, she gave him the full tour of what the press could and couldn't do, and he asked questions that were a week's worth of education compressed into an hour. Not questions that showed off knowledge, questions that revealed gaps he wanted to fill. There was a difference, and she had grown up around enough men who did the former to appreciate someone who did the latter. She found herself telling him more than she'd intended about the shop, about her father, about the clients they'd built up over 20 years, about the particular challenges of a print shop in a town that was deciding whether it was growing or not, whether it wanted a local paper or would keep importing one from the city, whether it valued the particular craft of hand typesetting or would eventually just want things done faster and cheaper. He listened with real attention. Not the polite attention of someone waiting for his turn to speak, actual listening, the kind that left marks on a person's face. "What would you print?" he asked. If money weren't the question, she looked at him. "What do you mean? If the shop were stable, if you could take on any project?" He was fitting a new bolt into the press's side frame as he asked, not looking at her. "What would you print?" No one had ever asked her that before. Her father had asked her what she thought they should print, which was different, a practical question about the market. This was something else. "A proper county paper," she said. "Weekly. Local news, proper reporting, not just reprinted dispatches, farming reports, legal notices, school announcements. Something that," she stopped, "something that made people feel the county was real and worth paying attention to." Rowe set down the bolt. "That's a good answer," he said simply, and went back to work. She didn't know why it affected her the way it did. It was a short sentence. It was just that no one had said that to her in quite that way in a very long time. On the morning of the third day, a carriage came. Cora saw it from the shop window. A private coach, expensive, with a crest on the door that she didn't recognize. It stopped at the end of Mill Road, and a man in a dark coat got out and stood looking at the buildings. He was middle-aged, with the bearing of a senior servant. Upright, efficient, the kind of stillness that came from decades of anticipating what was needed before it was asked. He hadn't come into the shop, but twice in the morning she noticed him in the street, and both times, when she glanced toward the window, he was looking at the shop. She mentioned it to Rowe in the afternoon, because she was not in the habit of not mentioning things. "There's a man outside who's been watching this building." Rowe was at the workbench with his back to her. He went very still. It was a small stillness, a breath held, a slight change in the set of his shoulders. But she caught it because she was standing 8 feet away and she was attentive to details. Printers had to be. "Tall man?" Rowe said. "Dark coat? You know him." It wasn't a question. Rowe turned around. The look on his face was complicated. It was the face of someone who had decided to do something and was now assessing exactly how to do it. She'd seen that expression before, usually in men who were about to disappoint her. "Miss Finch," he said, "I owe you an explanation. I'd say so." He pulled out a chair from the side table and sat down, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to stand. Sitting down meant a longer conversation. She sat across from him without being asked. "My full name," he said carefully, "is Roland Deverell." He paused. "The Viscount Ashby." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Ashby," Cora said. "Yes, as in the Ashby estate." "Yes," she thought about Durrell. She thought about the sign above the door with her father's name on it. She thought about the tin above the hearth, which was empty, and the rent she didn't have, and the man outside who'd come to collect the Viscount Ashby and return him to whatever he'd been trying to get away from. "You own this building," she said. "Technically, yes, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning." Something crossed his face that might have been shame. "No, I didn't. And I was wrong about that. And I understand if—" "How long have you been gone?" she asked. He paused, clearly having expected a different question. 8 months. Why? The question landed differently than the others. She watched him decide how to answer it, watched him measure what was owed against what was safe to give. And she waited. "My father died," he said at last, "and I inherited everything he'd built, and everyone I'd ever known had a view on what that meant for the rest of my life. He stopped. I needed to go somewhere that no one had a view on it. Somewhere I could just be a man who could or couldn't fix things." Cora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the way he'd crouched by the press on the first day, genuinely interested, not performing interest. She thought about the list he'd made, with the cheapest options marked. She thought about "that's a good answer," said without qualification. "The rent," she said. "What about it?" Durrell said it's owed and the building reverts on May 1st. Rowe, Deverell, looked as though she'd struck him. "When did Durrell come here?" 3 times. "Most recently Monday. I didn't. I haven't been managing the estate, I've been." He pressed 2 fingers to his forehead briefly. I'll sort it today, this afternoon. There will be no debt and no reversion, and Durrell will not come here again. I'm not asking you to forgive it," Cora said. He looked up sharply. "What?" "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for the time to pay what's owed, which the original arrangement entitled me to." She kept her voice level. "My father paid his rent faithfully for 22 years. The agreement changed without notice after your father died. I want it changed back." Deverell stared at her. "Yes," he said slowly. Yes, of course. That's what should have happened. Good." She stood up. "Then we understand each other." She walked back to the composing table and picked up the stick. Her hands were steady. She was rather proud of that. He left with the man in the dark coat, whose name, she gathered from the conversation, she wasn't quite close enough to hear through the shop window, was Faraday, and who had the expression of someone who had been looking for his employer for a very long time, and was restraining himself from saying so. The carriage was gone before evening. Ned came to stand beside her as she watched it go. "Is he coming back?" "I don't know," she said. "He fixed the press," Ned said, as though this were the relevant point. "He did. And he's the one who owns the building." "Yes." Ned was quiet for a moment. "Is that bad?" Cora turned away from the window. "Set the type for the Harrogate notices. We need to run them tomorrow morning." Ned went. He had learned when to leave it alone. She stood at the composing table for a while without setting anything. The press was fixed, the roller was good, the frame was true, the machine would run properly for the first time in months. She had that, at least. She told herself that was enough. He came back, not the next day or the day after, 5 days later, on a Monday, just before midday. No carriage this time. He arrived on horseback, dressed better. Not grand, but clean and well-fitted in the way that money managed invisibly, and tied the horse at the post, and came to the door and knocked in that same way, tentative and solid at once. She opened it. They looked at each other. "Miss Finch," he said. "Lord Ashby," she said, because she was not going to pretend the conversation hadn't happened. Something flickered in his face. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in and looked at the press running. She'd had a good week, 2 new orders and the Harrogate notices, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased in a way that was almost involuntary. "It's running well," he said. "You fixed it well." A pause. "I've sorted the rent." The original terms, going back to what they were under my father. "I've written to Durrell's replacement to make it clear." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a corrected lease. 20-year term, rent fixed, right of first refusal if the property is ever sold." Cora took the document and read it carefully. He waited without fidgeting. "This is very generous," she said. "It's fair," he said. "There's a difference." She looked up. He was watching her with the grey directness she remembered from the first day, and there was something in it that was careful and uncertain in a way that sat oddly with the title and the coat and the document. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said. About the county paper. I have some capital that isn't doing what it should. I have a building that needs tenants who take care of it." He paused. "And it seems to me that a county with a good paper is a more interesting county to have a stake in than one without." She set the document down on the composing table. "You want to invest in the paper? I want to propose it. You'd have full editorial control. I wouldn't touch the accounts or the type cases without asking." The corner of his mouth moved. "Those were good terms. I thought I'd use them." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it would mean. Having a partner with capital, having the building secure, having the paper she'd described to him with the particular clearness of a thing, said out loud for the first time to someone actually listening. She also thought about what it would mean in other ways, about the carriage and the crest, and a life that was built on a completely different scale than hers. "You live in a manor house," she said. "Yes, you have a title and an estate, and Faraday, I do, and you want to invest in a print shop in a county town." "I want to invest in this print shop," he said. "There's a difference." There was that phrase again. "There's a difference." She was beginning to understand that he used it when he meant something precisely. "I'd want a proper agreement," she said. "Written, witnessed, specific about what each party contributes and what each party controls. Yes, and I'd want it understood that my name is on this shop, and my editorial judgment is final, regardless of what the capital says." "Yes," he said again. "Cora." He stopped himself. "Miss Finch, I'm sorry." Cora is fine," she said carefully. "We have spent 3 days in the same building fixing a printing press. I think we're past formality." He looked at her steadily. "Roland," he said, "or Rowe if you prefer. It's what people used to call me before everything became Lord this and Lord that." "Rowe," she said, trying it. It fit him better than the title, and they both knew it. The paper launched that autumn. They called it The Millbrook Courier, which was her choice, and the first issue sold out by the following morning, which was the best possible answer to every person in the county who'd raised an eyebrow at the arrangement. There were plenty of eyebrows. A viscount in a financial partnership with a printer's daughter, one who declined to attend the manor dinner parties and insisted on setting type herself when the deadlines were tight. It was a story people had opinions about. She had expected that. She had not expected to find that she minded it less than she'd thought. She minded it less, she suspected, because Rowe never once suggested she should. He came to the shop twice a week when he was in the county, which was more often than she'd expected given the demands of an estate. He sat at the side table with correspondence while she worked, and they talked about the paper, what to cover, how to cover it, what the county needed to know about itself. He had a sharp mind for what mattered, and a disciplined quality of not saying things until he'd thought them through properly, which she respected enormously. He also had, she discovered over months, a very dry sense of humour that surfaced in the unlikeliest moments and was all the funnier for being so entirely unexpected. Ned adored him, which she noted without comment and which said something. She had known, somewhere around January, that she was in some difficulty. Not the press. The press was running beautifully. The other kind of difficulty, the kind that arrived quietly and refused to announce itself, and then was simply there one morning when she woke up and realised she'd been listening for the sound of a specific horse on Mill Road. She didn't say anything. She had never been good at saying things of that kind. She was better at typesetting and worse at everything the composing stick couldn't fix. And besides, there was the matter of the estate and the title and the particular mathematics of their situations, which did not, when she examined them honestly, add up neatly. It was April again when he asked her, in his careful, unhurried way, whether she would consider marrying him. They were in the shop. She was reading a proof. He was at the side table, and then suddenly he wasn't. He was standing nearby, and she looked up, and his face had the expression she'd come to recognise as something important is about to be said, and I have thought about it very carefully. I've thought about this for some time, he said. I want to be straightforward with you about what it would mean. The estate is real. The title is real. There are expectations that come with both, and I won't pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that none of that would ask you to be different than you are. You'd keep the shop. You'd keep the paper. You'd keep editorial control and the name above the door and the freedom to set type when you feel like it. That's a very practical proposal, she said. I'm a practical person, a beat. I'm also, Cora, I also very much want to marry you. Those two things are both true, and I didn't want the practical part to swallow the other part entirely. She set down the proof. Rowe, she said. Yes, I'm going to say yes. He exhaled. It was the first time she'd seen him lose composure, and it was brief, a single breath, and then he was steady again. But she'd seen it. But, she said. But, he agreed, waiting. The dinner's at the manor. I'll attend some. Not all. I won't wear the title like a costume, but I'll be present for the things that genuinely matter to the estate. The things that affect real people's lives. He nodded slowly. That's reasonable, and the shop stays mine. Not ours, not the estate's. Mine. Yes, I never wanted it otherwise, and if we disagree about the paper, you have final say, he said. That has always been the agreement. She looked at him. He looked back at her. You fixed my press, she said, before I even knew I could trust you. You gave me 3 days, he said, when you didn't have to. Terrible business decision, actually. Disastrous, he agreed. The corner of his mouth was moving again. She stood up and crossed the room to him, which she could see surprised him. She had a habit of staying behind things. The composing table, the press, a comfortable distance. She stopped just close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. I'm not going to be a very conventional viscountess, she said. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. The Millbrook Courier published its 1-year edition that October with a front page that Cora typeset herself as she always did, in the early hours before Ned came in and before Rowe arrived, with whatever correspondence he was routing through the shop, now that it had become a more convenient office than the manor. A development that had not gone unnoticed and not been commented on by either of them, because some things didn't need words. She married him in November at the county church, in a dress she'd chosen herself because she was fully capable of being married and having opinions about a dress at the same time. Ned stood up with them. Faraday attended with an expression of profound relief. The people in the county talked, of course. They talked about the match and the manor, and the fact that the Viscountess Ashby ran a print shop and could be found there on weekday mornings with ink on her fingers. They talked about it in the way people talk about things that trouble their sense of order. But the paper continued to run, and the press continued to print, and twice a week a horse came up Mill Road, and a man who was both a VISCOUNT and simply Rowe came through the door without knocking. He'd stopped knocking sometime in July, which she had noticed, and which had taken her nearly a week to stop smiling about, and sat at the side table and worked, and she typeset, and Ned came and went. And outside the county went on being a county that was real and worth paying attention to, which was in the end what she had always wanted. She hadn't needed rescuing. She had needed the roller fixed and the rent sorted, and one person in the world to ask her what she would print if money weren't the question. He had been that. She had been the answer to something he hadn't known how to name for himself, and they had, between them, made something that belonged to neither of them entirely, and to both of them completely. Which was, she thought, setting the last line of type for the morning run. Not so different from a very good press. It needed both the machine and the hand. Neither was enough alone.